When power met imagination, Machiavelli, Leonardo, and a river turned into a weapon. History likes to introduce its great figures one at a time. Machiavelli gets a desk, a candle, and a dangerous idea. Leonardo gets a sketchbook, a flying machine, and a half-finished masterpiece. So it feels slightly wrong to imagine them in the same place, working on the same problem, under the same deadline. And yet, for a brief and revealing moment, they were. Not in a salon, not in a philosophical debate, but inside a government project that hoped to solve a war by convincing a river to behave differently. That alone should make us suspicious. History rarely resists irony for long. At the beginning of the 16th century, Florence was not feeling particularly confident. The Renaissance glow that later centuries would admire was real, but so was anxiety. The city was rich, proud, and politically fragile. Its greatest irritation sat a short distance away: Pisa. Pisa had once been Florence's port, its window to the sea. Now it was independent, defiant, and inconveniently placed. Without Pisa, Florence's trade suffered. Without trade, its power thinned. Florence wanted the city back, but not at the cost of endless war. This was not a medieval feud driven by honor. It was an accounting problem with soldiers attached. Sieges were expensive, armies were unreliable. Mercenaries had a habit of switching sides when paid better. Florence needed a solution that was decisive, efficient, and preferably clever enough to avoid bloodshed. Clever solutions tend to attract unusual people. This is where Niccolò Machiavelli enters the room. Not as a brooding philosopher, not as the author future readers would love to misunderstand, but as a civil servant, a bureaucrat with sharp eyes, a man who read reports, negotiated with generals, and understood something many idealists never quite accept. States survive by effectiveness, not by good intentions. Machiavelli was not interested in appearing moral. He was interested in whether something worked. Across the city, Leonardo da Vinci was also being misunderstood in real time. Florence knew him as a painter, but Florence hired him as an engineer. Leonardo designed fortifications, inspected defenses, and filled notebooks with diagrams of machines meant to protect cities or tear them open. He was curious about beauty, yes, but he was obsessed with structure, with flow, with forces that could be redirected if understood properly. If Machiavelli thought about power, Leonardo thought about how power moved. Florence, under pressure, decided it might as well put these minds in the same orbit. The idea was deceptively simple. The Arno River flowed past Florence and toward Pisa. What if it didn't? What if the river were diverted before it reached the city? What if Pisa found itself flooded, or cut off from fresh water, or quietly suffocating behind its walls without a single heroic charge? This was warfare without banners, violence outsourced to geography. For Machiavelli, the logic was irresistible: victory without moral theater, control without spectacle. If war was inevitable, why not make it efficient? For Leonardo, the problem was irresistible for different reasons. Rivers were systems. Systems could be mapped. Mapped systems could be altered. Nature, in Leonardo's mind, was not sacred. It was understandable. And what is understood always invites intervention. So they worked. Surveys were drawn, measurements taken, plans discussed, canals imagined, earth calculated. Florence believed it was being modern. The irony is subtle but important. This was not madness. It was not fantasy. It was, given the knowledge of the time, a reasonable gamble. Engineering had already reshaped cities. Why not reshape the battlefield itself? The project promised a kind of victory that felt almost ethical. Less blood, less chaos, fewer widows. It appealed to a city that liked to think of itself as enlightened. History would later pretend this was arrogance. At the time, it felt like progress. But progress, as it turns out, still needs cooperation from reality. The soil along the Arno did not behave as expected. The terrain resisted calculation, water ignored intention, tools failed, coordination faltered, weather had its own opinion. The river, unimpressed by Florentine ambition, continued on its way. The project collapsed not in flames, but in silence. No dramatic catastrophe, no single moment of failure, just the quiet realization that the plan would not work. At least not now. At least not like this. Pisa remained free. Florence remained frustrated. And history, ever impatient, moved on. It would be easy to treat this as a footnote, a curious failure, a clever idea that didn't pan out. But that would miss the point entirely. What matters is not that the river refused to cooperate. What matters is that a state believed it could ask. This moment reveals something essential about the shift taking place beneath Renaissance politics. War was no longer just about courage and swords. It was becoming technical, managerial, abstract. Machiavelli would later write about power with a clarity that unsettled readers for centuries. But here, before the books, before the reputation, we see the thinking in action. Power was something to be designed, not dramatized. Leonardo, too, would be remembered for art that made people look upward. But here, he was looking downward into soil and water, translating nature into diagrams that a government could fund. This was not art serving beauty. It was intelligence serving survival. There is a temptation to imagine their collaboration as a meeting of titans, full of philosophical conversation and mutual admiration. The truth was likely more practical. Deadlines, reports, adjustments. The shared understanding that failure was an option, but inaction was worse. States rarely wait for perfect ideas. The failure of the Arno project did not discourage this way of thinking. If anything, it confirmed it. Future wars would rely even more heavily on engineers, logistics, and planners who never lifted a sword. Rivers would be redirected, terrain reshaped, nature drafted into service. This was not the end of heroic warfare, but it was the beginning of something quieter and far more durable. What Florence attempted was an early rehearsal of modern power, a world where imagination and administration sit at the same table, where intelligence replaces valor as the decisive weapon, where victory is measured less in glory and more in efficiency. Machiavelli understood this instinctively. His later writings would simply give language to what he had already seen, that power does not care how it is judged, only whether it holds. Leonardo understood it differently. For him, the fascination was not dominance but possibility. If nature followed rules, then rules could be used. Not always successfully, but often enough to try again. The river's refusal was not a moral judgment, it was a technical limitation. And technical limitations, history shows, are temporary. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson of their meeting. Not that genius always succeeds, not that ambition is always rewarded, but that once power and imagination learn to collaborate, they rarely stop trying. The Arno flowed on, indifferent. Pisa survived. Florence adapted. And somewhere in that failure, the modern world took note.